Welcome to week 12 of the two-year Bible study. This week we're going to be taking a look at Exodus 12 through 22. In Exodus chapter 12, we have the final plague and simultaneously the start of the first Jewish festival called Passover. With this plague, Pharaoh is not at risk. I don't believe that he's a firstborn, and really just shows the callousness of his heart. Uh, he puts his son on the line in order to try and keep the Israelites. Although other interpreters suggest that the firstborn are only of the household as they stand at the proclamation, and so only Pharaoh's son is killed. I really do think that Pharaoh is probably not a firstborn, and so he has no risk in this. But either way, he puts his son's life at risk in order to keep his slaves. In verse 13, we have a very important verse that says, "The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. Without the blood of the lamb, there is death." And this is an important concept for us to grasp already here. And this is a unique element in that the lamb is sacrificed, but not sacrificed as part of the temple or tabernacle time frame. This is kind of a pre-tabernacle, pre-temple time frame. And so still here we see the same element that the blood of the lamb is necessary to avert death. We also have the removal of yeast for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In verse 15, it says, "For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the seventh must be cut off from Israel." And yeast came to mean several different, kind of encapsulate multiple different meanings throughout Scripture. And I want to identify those because we're going to keep coming back to yeast as we continue to read through Scripture. And so this Feast of Unleavened Bread, where there's a removal of yeast, symbolizes at least three different scriptural elements. First of all, in verse 34 of chapter 12, we read, "So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing." So this really highlights that yeast tended to represent settledness versus that of a sojourner, somebody who is traveling. And certainly yeast reminds us that we must not settle where God does not settle us. However, when we continue on, and in verse 39, we read, "With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves." Egypt, in many ways, represents the world, and specifically, the yeast represents the pleasures of the world. And so, removing the yeast is disengaging ourselves from the pleasures of the world. We must not, or we must separate ourselves from the comforts of this world. And then, as we move into chapter 13, we also see in verse 3 that Moses said to the people, "Commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Eat nothing containing yeast." And in this third element, there is this idea of a removal of sin. Egypt represented sinfulness, and so we must remove ourselves from enslavement to sin by the Lord's miraculous work. So we cannot do it ourselves, and yet by the same token, we participate in that disengagement from the pleasures of the world by becoming a sojourner, so that we can be removed from our enslavement to sin. So while God was the one who was at work in all of this, still He has His people partner with what He is doing by doing these rituals that represent the spiritual truths that are happening. And so we're going to return to yeast quite a bit as we continue our studies. In in chapter 13, verses 12 through 16, there is the redemption of the firstborn. And so every firstborn must be redeemed as a constant reminder of what God had done. If they were clean firstborn male animals, then they would be sacrificed to the Lord. If they were unclean firstborn male animals, they would need to be redeemed by a clean animal. And for every firstborn male son, they also need to be redeemed. And as we're going to see later on in our reading, that redemption is not by killing the son or sacrificing the son to God, because God abhors child sacrifice, but in a payment to the tabernacle or temple to redeem the child, because the firstborn child is God's, based on how he rescued the Israelites through the Exodus. As you move on to chapter 14, we are kind of fast forwarding a bit. The plague has happened. Pharaoh has told the Israelites go. The Israelites leave Egypt, and they get to a point in their travels where they have either the Suez Bay or the Aqaba Bay. I think it's the Aqaba Bay, actually. But either Suez or Aqaba Bay in front of them, and no escape behind them, with the Egyptians bearing down upon them. And so they are stuck. They have this water in front of them. They have the Egyptians behind them. There's no place else for them to go. And in chapter 14, verses 10 through 12, we read, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. And they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? And we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And of course, we are going to look at each one of these complaints against either Moses or God. And this particular one, I chuckle a little bit at, because of course there's more than enough graves in Egypt. Even to this day, one of the primary features that you think of when you think of Egypt are their tombs, right? The pyramids, as well as the other archaeological work that's been done there. Well, we find that God, of course, is going to rescue his people. In verse 15, the Lord says to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. And he explains to Moses to raise his staff, and that he's going to have the Israelites walk through the water on dry ground, and the Egyptians to be destroyed within that same water. And so there is a sense in which sin is conquered, their enslavement is freed, they are made God's people, they walk through the waters, kind of cleansing themselves. And all of this is a parallel to baptism. We find in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 2, that Paul equates this walking through the Red Sea in terms of baptism when we get to the New Testament. But we're quite a ways from there right now, but we begin to hear those echoes of the New Testament coming through here. In chapter 14 of Exodus, in verses 19 and 20, then the angel of the Lord, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so that neither went near the other all night long. I'm not really sure whether whether the angel of the Lord and the pillar of cloud are intended to be the same. However, it seems as though they're differentiating between each other. Certainly, the angel of the Lord likely is a pre-incarnation of Jesus, as we've said before. But Jesus is represented in so many of these metaphors that are being used, as we're going to see in a little bit, during the desert travels, that it's hard to make a distinguishing between them. However, we do know that God is with them, both protecting from Egypt and providing with delight. And so God is simultaneously protecting and providing for them. In 14 verse 31, we read, and when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. This is one of the highlights of Israel's faith. We don't see a whole lot of these over the course of the next 40 plus years. But when they see God's rescue of his people, they fear him. And this really is one of the strongest points of Israel's faith in God. Well, as we move on to chapter 15, we read the Song of Moses, and especially as we get to verses 13 through 17, we see that these are God's people because of what he has done. And we're going to see this as a common refrain throughout, certainly throughout the Pentateuch, if not the rest of the Old Testament, that these are God's people because of what he has done for them. Even when in a few chapters, when we get to the Ten Commandments, starts out, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Therefore, I want you to live a particular way. And so these are God's people, not because of what they have done, not because of what they will do, not because of their obedience or faithfulness. These are God's people because of what he has done. Well, after we get over the rejoicing, there is some movement around. And in verse 23 through 27, especially verse 24, the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what are we to drink? And all they have is bitter water around them. And so God has Moses throw a branch into the water becomes drinkable. And what's interesting is God was prepared to provide for them even when they don't have faith. But of course, in verse 27, we see then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. In other words, if they had only waited, they would have seen God's provision. It wasn't as though God had forgotten about them. He didn't want them to go thirsty in the desert or die in the desert, certainly, but instead to trust him that he was bringing them to a good place. And so they really didn't need the waters at Marah because they were going to shortly come to Elim. And I think that's a good message for us as well, that sometimes we get ahead of God and we don't trust that he's going to bring us to a good place. Well, in 16, we see some more grumbling in the desert, 16 verse 2, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. They grumbled that they ate better in Egypt. Of course, in Egypt, they were slaves. Here they are free. And so God provides manna to them. And in verse 4, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I'll test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. So he provides enough for each day. And so they're only supposed to take enough for that particular day. But of course, in verse 20, however, some of them paid no attention to Moses, and they kept part of it until morning. But it was full of maggots and began to smell. And so Moses was angry with them. So in other words, some people knew what God had said, and yet they still gathered more than they needed and tried to keep it till the next day. But God doesn't allow for that. In addition, God had provided enough so that when the people went out on Friday, they could get 2 days worth. And Friday's gathering would cover them for Saturday, the Sabbath. And then Sunday would pick up again with the 1 day of gathering. And of course, you can only imagine if somebody had gathered 2 days worth on the first Sunday and it went bad on Monday, that they get to Friday and they're like, I'm not sure I'm going to do this 2 day thing. And yet that's what God had said to do. God had provided such that they could rest on the Sabbath if they chose to, but he wasn't going to bless them if they didn't rest. And that's what we see happen in verse 27. Never, excuse me, nevertheless, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? These were easy commands. Compared to the rest of the law that we're going to be reading, these were quite easy. But if we cannot obey God in the little things, how are we ever going to be able to obey him in the bigger things? Now, of course, all of this is important to us as New Testament believers, because Jesus tells us himself in John chapter 6 that he is the bread that comes down from heaven. And so the way that the Israelites are treating the manna is in many ways the way that they're treating Jesus Christ. Well, in 17 verse 2, they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. So they're quarreling again, asking for some water. And God is told by Moses in verse 5, go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. And so so Moses did this. I wonder, I don't know this for certain, I hold this loosely, but I wonder if the cloud of God didn't move in front of the rock. And so Moses striking the rock had to strike through the cloud to hit the rock. And I say this because this also in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, is tied to Jesus again. And so this becomes a picture of the ministry of Jesus, that he would be stricken and crucified, and yet out of that would come living water for everyone. And so I wonder when God says that he's going to stand before the rock, whether the cloud itself didn't actually position itself in front of the rock so that Moses could strike through the cloud and hit the rock. Well, as they're camping in this place, the Amalekites come. The Amalekites are the grandson of Esau. So Amalek was the grandson of Esau, and out of Amalek came this nation of people. And they attack Israel unprovoked. And so Joshua and his men are fighting the Amalekites in the valley. Moses, Aaron, and Hur. Some people think Hur might have been Miriam's husband. We're not really sure, but certainly Moses, Aaron, and Hur are up on a mountain overseeing the battle. And every time that Moses raises his arms, they begin to have victory. And as he lowers his arms, they begin to have defeat. And so after a period of time of them recognizing this, eventually Aaron and Hur come beside Moses and lift up his arms so that they might have victory over the people. I think this is an incredibly important lesson for us to learn, that we cannot serve God alone, that we really need others around us, and that sometimes our victory and defeat are dependent on the faithfulness of others, or they of us, who might be having less victory in their life, not in your mind directly associated with you, but because of your unfaithfulness, they might be wavering. And so we need to recognize that intimate connectedness, especially as believers, that our faithfulness and unfaithfulness both affect others. Well, as we get into chapter 18, verses 13 through 23, we see that there is the visit by Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. And Jethro sees all these people come to Moses every single day with every single concern that they have. And so he wisely tells Moses to assign certain people to teach them how to judge people well, and kind of sets up almost like a court system. There might be the lower courts that, you brought your normal stuff to, but if people weren't happy with that, they could appeal to kind of these higher leaders in the judgment. And then if if it didn't work out there, they could appeal finally to Moses. And it's just a reminder to us that we cannot serve God alone. Moses was trying to do everything on his own, um, and with good reason. In verse 20, it says, teach them his decrees and instructions and show them the way that they are to live and how they are to behave. This was the goal of Moses. But of course, good disciplers always pass that discipleship role on to others who can then pass it on to others as well. And so we need to be reminded, as Moses did, that we cannot serve God alone. As you move into chapter 19, we finally get to Sinai. And in verses 10 through 13, we read that the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, have them wash their clothes. Be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai and say to the people, put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. God had said that they could approach him, but we approach God on his terms, not ours. We don't get to determine what the terms are for approaching God. He is the one. And approaching him without being prepared, without being cleansed, without being readied, will bring death. In chapter 5 or verse 15, there's also this statement that Moses says to people, prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations. Now, sometimes people have suggested that, this is suggesting that, sex is dirty in some way. But I think the abstinence here is either of two reasons. One might be as a form of fasting. So just as you might fast from eating, which is a good thing, that Moses is saying that the people can prepare their hearts by fasting from sexual relations, which is also a good thing. But I suspect that it has to do with ensuring cleanliness. And so you have clean and unclean in the Old Testament. Unclean doesn't mean sinful. It just means not prepared to be used as an instrument of worship, either as an individual or as a thing or animal. And so, so the uncleanness here is not because sex is dirty, but because we're going to see as we go through the law, anytime there's an expelling of bodily fluid, it represents the loss or the leaving of life from the individual. And so that isn't the only thing that makes a person unclean. However, when we take a look at sexual relations specifically, there's an expelling of bodily fluid, and so therefore that act makes one unclean, not because sex is dirty, not because it's sinful, but because there is this representation of the loss or the leaving of life from the individual. And so I think in this case, Moses is telling them to abstain to ensure that they are clean on the third day. As we get into Exodus chapter 20, a very familiar passage to us, the Ten Commandments are given. And I believe that the Ten Commandments reveal two aspects that are going to become really critical throughout the entirety of the Old Testament and into the New Testament. Of course, in the New Testament, we realize that, or we hear Jesus saying that the greatest commandment is to love God, and the second is like it, to love others. And in the Ten Commandments, we see both sides of this. We see this revelation of idolatry. That's where we don't love God well. And this pursuit of injustice, where we don't love others well. And so much of what we're going to see in the laws are tied to, do you love God? Do you love others? What is causing idolatry in your life? What is causing injustice in your life? And that's going to be expanded on significantly as we go through the laws in the coming chapters and books. In verse 21, we see that the people are now invited to approach God, but the people in verse 21 remained at the distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Rather than approaching God as invited, the people stayed at a distance and sent Moses on their behalf. In some ways, I think this is very similar to the garden when Adam and Eve are asked by God, "Where are you?" He's calling them to himself, and instead they stay hidden in the bushes. And to some degree, I think this is the way that the people of Israel are relating to God as well. That they recognize that they've been invited by God, and so it's safe. God wouldn't invite people if it was unsafe for them, and yet they still stay at a distance away from God. Well, we get a breakdown of idols and altars here, and again, this idea of approaching God in the right way becomes very important. He says it in verse 25. He says, "If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it, and do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed." As we've already said, we approach God on his terms, and God is the creator. He can create and prepare rocks for his altars. He doesn't need man to prepare them. He doesn't need man to either make them look nicer. God is the creator. He can make rocks that are good for his altar. So that kind of explains the first half of verse 25. But as we get into verse 26, I think it's important for us to think of nakedness really from a Middle Eastern view of nakedness. So when we think of nakedness, we think of no clothing whatsoever. But of course, in far more conservative and certainly Middle Eastern cultures, nakedness could be just, anything from your thighs down. If your knees or your ankles are showing or your shoulders are showing, that's really considered nakedness. And so after the fall, one of the first things that Adam and Eve recognize is their nakedness. And they recognize that they are shamed by it. And so while nakedness is not a bad thing, this is how God created us. By the same token, sin has skewed that. And so nakedness comes to represent the defilement of sin. Well, when we think about the altar was an area where the priest would stand on the ground and reach over into the altar to both place and to move sacrifices that were on the altar. Well, it would be so much easier to do that from above, right? It's always easier to work from above, reaching down, as opposed to trying to reach across, especially a very hot, burning altar. And so they would be tempted perhaps to create steps so that they could stand on top of the altar and have a little bit easier way of working. But of course, that would mean that think of it as the altar almost anthropomorphically looking up the robe of the priest. Now, the priest had undergarments, so there wasn't a true nakedness that we would think of, but their lower legs would have been exposed, and thus having steps that would make working with the altar easier would mean that the altar is exposed to the underside of the priest's robe. And so again, there's this idea that we don't approach God the way we want to approach him. It might be easier for us to create steps and work on top of the altar than from the side, but we don't get to decide how we approach God. God is the one who tells us how to approach him. Well, as we move into Exodus chapter 21, we begin to see some commands on servants. And in verse 2, we see, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he's to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he's to go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. So master doesn't get to keep the wife. So marriage is important to God, to keep the people together. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. So because the woman was originally the master's, and the man didn't come into enslavement with the wife, the wife stays. But Verse 5, if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl, and then he will be his servant for life. I tend to see in this a picture of the incarnation, in which Christ eternally takes on humanity. He loved us, and because he loved us, he's willing to be pierced for us and remain in this incarnate state, this state of having fully God, fully deity, but also fully humanity for all of eternity. Well, as we go through these different laws that are in chapter 21, we see that life is valuable to God, and the one who takes or harms life is going to be held to a very high standard. For instance, in verse 15, we see anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. And in verse 17, anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. Parental authority is held in very high esteem. Now, notice that the father and mother are mentioned. There's an equality that is being declared here. And our relationship with parents is patterned on our relationship with God. So if we are so flippant as to curse our parents, we will likely be just as flippant in cursing God. And so as we move on, also in verses 20 and 21, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. And then verse 26, an owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. There is, we live in a culture that rightly seeks the freedom of all people. However, God works within the cultures of the time frame that he is revealing to them, and so enslavement is a part of the society at this time. A very different type of enslavement, I might add, than the type of slavery that was experienced in America, but still enslavement. And yet, even in the midst of this, there's a valuing of the servant that is seen here nowhere else in the world at this particular time. There could actually be ramifications, even capital punishment to the master if punishment went beyond what was reasonable. And so while servants and slaves are spoken of in terms of ownership and property, they are still humans, and thus their life and limb remain important to God. And this humanness, and this humanizes servants and slaves in a way that the ancient world simply could not conceive. Well, when we get to verse 22, if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now notice there's no distinction based on gender. It doesn't say if it's a male child or a female child. There is an equality of children here, which again is really quite unheard of in the ancient world. And then when we get to verse 28, if a bull gores a man or a woman, the bull is to be put to death. And this law applies in verse 31 if the bull gores a son or a daughter. Again, notice the equality across gender and ages. Even servants have value. And so there is a humanizing of all people that really is not to be matched anywhere else in the ancient world of this time. Well, in Exodus chapter 22, we see that God is concerned about justice and restitution and the treatment of others. In verse 19, there's a prohibition against any sexual relations with an animal. And bestiality and Hittite and Canaanite law forbade sex with a sheep, cow, or pig, but would allow for a horse or a mule, which seems to be somewhat common in Canaan. And that's why this comes up a number of different times within the law. And then we are also told in verses 25 and forward that that no interest is to be charged to God's people. The charging of interest suggests an avoiding of the responsibility. So if somebody couldn't do something on their own because they were impoverished, they would seek to loan money in order to be able to take care of themselves. And that money could be charged at an interest. But what God is saying is that if these people are impoverished, the Israelite community is to take care of the poor, not to create an interest-bearing loan upon people who are already in difficulty. So the charging of interest actually avoided the responsibility to care for the poor or their fellow man. Well, that gets us into the beginning parts of Exodus. As we move forward from here, we are going to be moving into the building of the tabernacle. And so we'll be discussing those as we move into this week and in next week's summary. Until then, God bless you.